Do you, like many people around you, judge yourself by those who you see in social media, at work, at home, siblings, even kids, for example? It's really important to understand that your ideal self represents a level of personhood that you want to aspire to. And this is important because there are real ways to identify your ideal self and to understand who you want to be in the context of who you are right now. Who you want to be is called the ideal self. Who you are right now is called the actual self. And you've also got what's called the ought self, which is a sense, or a moral sense almost, of who you ought to be. And the ideal and ought self are really interesting because they kind of mirror and back on each other. All this sort of stuff reflects back to who you are right now, your actual self. This theory I'm proposing is called self-discrepancy theory. Researchers have said about self-discrepancy theory, when people perceive a discrepancy between their actual self and their ideal self, they tend to feel emotions such as disappointment, dissatisfaction, shame, and embarrassment. People who experience a discrepancy between their actual selves and their ought self feel emotions such as anxiety, fear, resentment, guilt, self-contempt, and uneasiness. We often want to become better than what we are, or we want what somebody else has. And there's a bit of a gap between what we want and who we are right now in most people. You'd find some people that are very content with who they are and what they've achieved, and then you also find other people who are just not there yet. What this particular theory looks at is how you relate in the context of other people, and understanding that, being more and more aware of your own social standing, your own personal standing, and your own aspirations are really important to developing who you want to be. Another psychological theory that builds on top of this is called the social identity framework. This framework argues that our sense of identity is heavily influenced by the social groups we belong to. We come to identify it with certain social groups based upon the extent to which we think we share similarities with other group members. Then, in order to maintain a positive sense of our social identity, we try to ensure that our group, the in-group, is favored over the out-groups. I think this is really important. In any day, in any period, we always want to belong. We want to belong to a particular group. One day it might be that you define yourself based on what it is that you wear, or what type of hobbies that you hold, or the type of ideological beliefs or political beliefs that you have. And I think this is really important to buffer against, and to understand that in-group and out-group identities are a real thing. We develop a positive sense of our in-group based on a negative sense of our out-group. We don't want to be like these people. We would rather be like these people. And that creates a sort of tribalized sense of who we are and what we aspire to. And it's not always good. It's probably almost never good, because these are the ingredients that are required to build hostility, to build even conflict, whether physical, emotional, or otherwise. There's a classic psychological study called the Robbers Cave experiment. In that study, they took 22 white middle-class Protestant boys and they flung them into a campsite in Oklahoma, the United States, called the Robbers Cave State Park. In this experiment, the kids were divided up into two groups, and they were asked to give their groups a name. One of the groups was called the Eagles, and the other group was called the Rattlers, after rattlesnakes. These groups were separated, and they were basically told to do various camp activities like set up tents, go on hikes, go swimming, or play games, all that sort of stuff, in their separate groups. Then, after a bit of time, they were put against each other, and they were asked to compete against each other in certain tasks. And the winners would get rewards, whereas the losers would get nothing. Further to this, the psychologists contrived certain elements of the conditions. So there would be one group that would arrive late to a camp lunch, and all their food was eaten by the other groups. There were many different types of contrived situations like these, and that kind of led to the groups developing a hostility towards each other. They began to taunt each other, make threats to each other, and even ultimately get into fistfights with one another. It got so bad that one of the groups broke into the other group's cabins and overturned their mattresses and beds and stole a bunch of their stuff. And the researchers had to restrain some of the boys from physically hurting each other. Once this happened, there was a bit of a cooling off period. The groups were separated and they were allowed to cool off for a couple days before the researchers decided to put together some tasks for both the groups to do together. These were called superordinate goals. They were tasked to fix a water reservoir that had been broken that fed straight into the camp's water supply. They had to pool their money to watch a particular movie, and each person in each group had to put a certain amount of money together, otherwise they wouldn't be watching that particular movie. And they also were required to pull a bogged camp truck. So ropes were tied to the truck and they all had to work together to pull the truck out of the ditch that it was stuck in. These superordinate goals actually brought the boys a lot closer when they were all working towards a particular goal. And the result was less name calling, less taunting, much higher levels of cohesion between the groups. And the groups even chose to mingle together when they were eating rather than staying separately into their own corners. What does this even mean, and how can we understand these sorts of group dynamics when it comes to ourselves and our own self-awareness? Well, when we understand ourselves as belonging to a part of a group, we understand ourselves often by some of the elements of these groups. But that's not always the case because we are so complex. We are such complex human beings that we cannot just be judged by our own group identity. This jumps into a level of identity politics. So I would make haste to try to step away from that understanding, but also to understand that our groups do influence how we see ourselves. But we are much more than that. And understanding ourselves as we appear to other people is really important. And so how can we understand ourselves at a greater level as we are perceived by other people? Well, there were some researchers back in the 50s, around the same time that the Robbers Cave experiment was being conducted, that developed a conceptual framework around understanding yourself. And this concept was called the Johari window. In this window, you have a few quadrants, and these quadrants include the arena, which is the part of yourself that's known to yourself as well as known to other people. After that one, you have what's called the blind spot, something about yourself that's not known to you but is known to other people. You have the facade, something that is known to yourself but not known to other people. And then you have the unknown self, something that's not known to you and not known to others. Okay, so what does any of this mean? Well, basically, the more you know about yourself and you share with others, the more this becomes known to everybody. Whereas if there's something that you hold, something that you're ashamed about or you just don't want to share with somebody else, that becomes more of a facade. So some people have an understanding of what they think you are or who they think you are, whereas you have something that you're withholding from them. Blind spots are things that other people see in you and you just can't recognize in yourself, where you vehemently oppose and then you ask a few people what are their thoughts about you, and everyone's saying the same thing and you're just like, nah, don't want to accept it. That becomes a blind spot. When it comes to the unknown self, these are things that you don't know about yourself, other people don't know about you. Basically, these are things that have formed you into who you are, but you haven't yet taken time to sit down, think about them, and other people haven't really thought about them either, because most people are more interested in their goings on and what it is that they do, rather than sit down and think about why you are the way that you are. This obviously changes from person to person, so it's not a categorical remark, but it is something that we have seen. So what's the aim here? The aim is for people that you trust, for people that are close to you, you want to start by increasing what you share about yourself and being reciprocated by hearing these sorts of things from other people as well. Think about a dating relationship. When you're talking, sharing a little bit about yourself, you share a tiny bit and you see how the other person reacts, responds. And if they share something a bit vulnerable about themselves, then rapport is an outcome. It's something that you start to bond with that other person. And if you share a little bit too much and the person doesn't share or reciprocate that, then that can be a bit of a boundary crossing. So it's a little bit of a nuanced approach, and we can apply the same dating principles to people that you trust, people that you want to share a little bit more about yourself and find out more about them. So it becomes more and more of an even playing ground. And in turn, you want to understand a little bit more about who you are as a person so that you can better yourself, understand yourself, and do a bit of that digging. A really good way of doing this is asking for feedback. And we'll get into this a little bit more in our next session, but just as a bit of a taster, it's about understanding and asking questions to people like, hey, what do you think about this? Or I acted in this way. What do you think about how I acted in this situation? And then really taking on that feedback and understanding why it is the way that you did a particular thing. Asking for feedback requires an openness and a opportunity and an openness not to feel defensive afterwards, because you might get that initial sense, okay, I don't really want to hear what this person has to say. Trying to open yourself up is a good indicator of learning something new. In essence, it's just putting your ego aside and trying to understand how other people see you and how you fit into the democracy of social relationships. So to summarize, it's really important to understand that we are often defined by how we see each other in terms of our temperament, our personality, our self-concept, the groups that we belong to, and negotiating that and sharing and finding out a little bit more about yourself is one of the best things that you can do when it comes to increasing your self-awareness. At the same time, that requires an openness to do these sorts of things and an openness to be a bit vulnerable. So when it comes to vulnerability, that's a big task in itself. It's related to stress and self-concept and self-esteem and all that sort of stuff. Yet an openness is imperative to see yourself objectively as other people potentially see you, and asking questions and learning a little bit more and trying to take yourself out of your own situation and assessing how it is that you're acting. Revealing a little bit more about yourself and having that reciprocated by others builds relationships. Self-awareness is an outcome, and as we move on in this course, our final session will focus on increasing self-awareness through very practical, very simple strategies, and so we'll go into that next. It's been a pleasure having you today. Join me in our next session as we move forward.